Hey, David Ralphoff here with another video. In this one, I'm going to be going over the dialogue system from the previous video, but also kind of walking through how to add choices to that, or how I set up adding questions and choices as part of the dialogue system. So I'm just going to run it here real quick, and we can take a look at what it looks like. So actually, let me turn this off. Okay, sorry. Here we go. So yeah, like before, we're gonna have to hit spacebar to initiate the dialogue here, and then you'll see we've got Chun-Li on the right, just talking to Evil Ryu, and then we're setting up a choice about who she wants to fight, and then now you'll see at the end of that conversation, we're now presented with these three choices here. And each of these choices is going to lead to another conversation. We'll just take a look real quick at what one of these looks like. So here you can see this choice is set up with the text for the option, and then it also has a field here for the conversation that we should get. So the first choice is going to go to the next conversation between Chun-Li and Evil Ryu, and then the second choice would lead to another conversation with Akuma. So we'll just click Akuma for the sake of this, and you can see now there's another conversation that started with Akuma talking on the right, and we can just go through that, and then that's it. So yeah, this is just kind of a quick first pass on introducing questions and choices. Right now, the only thing it will do is kind of lead you to continue conversations. It doesn't actually, this isn't attached to a game yet, so it's not, there's no actions or anything that are coming out of this or like state changes, but the dialogue systems can get pretty complicated, so this is just kind of like the next pass at this. I'll probably do some more passes, but I just wanted to go through kind of quickly how that is set up. So previously I covered setting up this conversation and the conversation controller, and that basically takes a scriptable object for the conversation, which keeps track of who's the character speaking on the left and who's the character speaking on the right, and then what are what lines of dialogue will they have, and then in addition to that, now I've added the ability to either at the end of that jump to a next conversation or to load a question. So you can see there's fields for that over here on the side. And just to give you an example of one of those conversations, we can look at that first one. So here, Chun-Li's the speaker on the left, Evil Ryu is the speaker on the right, and then for each of these, I'm calling them lines in the conversation, you can see there's a character and then whatever their line is, and it'll just go through those in order, and depending on whether the speaker's on the left or right, it'll show and hide the UI for the left and the right side. So that was all covered for the most part in the previous video. The only pieces here that are new are the ability to either lead into another conversation, or to ask a question, which would then lead into another conversation. So those are the parts I'll be going over in more detail here. So in terms of the game objects that I've added, you can see now I have a question game object over here, and I'll just turn that on for a second so we can see what that looks like. So that is basically just a panel in the back and then a title for the question. And then I have a container for all of the choices, a game object that'll just be a container for all the choices. And then I just have one example choice button in here. And this can be configured to look, however you'd like it to look, or wherever wherever you want it to be positioned. And then there's some more things going on here that I'll get to in a minute, but the general idea is we'll have a scriptable object that's a question, which is just, has a question in it. And then it's got a set of choices, and each of those choices has text and the conversation that it'll trigger if you choose it. and it could be any number of those. So I'm just putting in an example choice here in the UI that we'll just like use to duplicate for each of the provided choices. And you can see over here, there's an event associated with making that choice. That's what I'm calling the conversation change event. And by setting up that event, we can have things listen for when it happens, so that anything that we want to be paying attention to this conversation changing can pay attention to it, but we don't have to directly reference all the things that might care about that in the controller for this choice. We can just, by using an event, we can have anything that cares about it subscribe to that event and do whatever it needs to do. So you can see here, when the conversation changes, one of the things that's listening to this is the conversation controller, and it has a method called change. So when one of these choices is made, we know we have a new conversation, so we're calling change on that controller, and it'll handle updating the conversation. And then also the question controller, which controls the overall question and the choices, is listening as well here. And you can see if you click on that, that's going to highlight on the left, or at least the game object's going to highlight. And yeah, the question game object's question controller has a hide method, and that's what's going to get called when this event gets triggered. So anytime there's a choice made here, all we have to do is have these things listen, and they can update themselves. And you could imagine too, this would be pretty flexible. Like we could either pass along like maybe like a stat change or an inventory change along with the conversation, and have something just listening for that here. So doing this with events is just kind of nice and flexible. So anyway, I'll just take a look at the code over here. There's not a whole lot more to the game object part. If we take a look at an example, let's see, an example question. So this is an instance I made from the question scriptable object. You can see it just has the text for the question, and then here are the different selections, the different options, choices, and then you can see each of those has a specific conversation that it'll trigger here. And those again are just instances of the conversation game object. So let me bring the code up for those. Yeah, so a question is just a scriptable object, and it has text in this little thing here. Just tells it in the UI we want a text area that's 2 lines. So that way we can do line breaks and stuff if we need to easily. And then here we just have a list of choices. And up here, you can see we're defining what the choices are. And a choice, again, is just has text. We want to have at least 2 lines, so it's easy to do multiple lines. And then just whatever the conversation is that should trigger. And this is just a simple struct. And then by using system serializable, this will be easily editable from the Unity inspector, which is always nice. Anytime you can make these things easy to edit from the Unity inspector, that means anybody can go in and edit it that has access to it. They don't have to get into coding or anything, or separate data files or whatever. And so that's pretty much how the questions are set up. There's controllers for each of these new objects here, so maybe we can just take a look at those real quick. This one's going to look a little bit complicated, but I'm just going to talk through it. It's really not too difficult. The first thing that we have to do with the choices is actually be able to create them in the UI. So here I have a static method on the class that takes the choice button template, which is the game object that we've already made, and it it's just going to copy that for each of the choices on the question, and then it takes whatever the choice is, and then whatever its index is in the list, because we need to know that to figure out how to position the choices relative to each other. And then with that information, it knows enough to figure out, basically how to make a copy of the template, sets its parent to be the container for all the choices, and then that way we can set the position relative to the container. Sets its scale to 1. I don't know why you have to do this, but I noticed both my scale and my position were like the values that got automatically were just kind of weird floats that were a little bit off from what I expected. So I just went ahead and manually set those. And then on the position, we just want to multiply the spacing by where it is in the list of choices. So that's all this is trying to do here. And then just setting the name of the button to be something that's makes sense. So this is just choice. This is going to show up as choice 1, choice 2, choice 3. And then basically turn it on, because by default I have all of the question and its children not set to active. And then basically here just get the choice controller off of the button so that we can actually set the data up that we want. And so that particular choice button is going to have a choice, and we're just setting the choice here. It's the one that was passed in to this static method. And at the end, we return the controllers. I'll show you why we're doing that here in a minute, but basically we just need to keep a list of the active choices so we can do whatever we need to with those. And then in the start method for the choice, in order, we essentially have to initialize the conversation change event. So if there isn't one set, we just make a new conversation change event. And I'll show that to you up here. We have to define a conversation change event class that derives from Unity, and we're going to be passing a conversation object with that. So we have to set that here as the type for this. And then by making it system serializable, we can make those changes in the Unity inspector that I was showing you, where you just watch for an event and have different things react based on that event. And then here we're actually making our instance of this conversation change event, or at least a placeholder for it. So the other thing we have to do here is we have to actually get the text component, off of the child object, and set its text to be the text of the choice. So that's what you're actually going to see on the choice in Unity. And then the last thing we have here is just a make choice method, which will invoke this event that we've made, and it'll invoke it with the conversation that's attached to that choice. And that conversation's what the other things are listening for to figure out what to load next, which conversation to load next. So yeah, that's everything for the choice controller. And then I'll hop over to the question controller. So the question's in charge of showing the UI for the question, and then loading up all the choices and managing those. So this one is slightly more complicated, but basically it needs to track what the question is. It needs to know where to show the question text, and then we also want to know where one of these choice buttons is, so that we can pass that along to use as the template to generate the other choices from. And then we also want to keep track of a list of all the controllers for the choices. So that's what this is doing. And I'll show you why that is. So every time one changes, we're gonna get a new question here. And what we'll want to do is remove all the previous choices. Hold on to whatever the new question is. We'll want to turn on the question UI, so we'll set that to active. And then we'll call initialize here, and I'll show you what that does in a bit. And also have a method here because we need the ability to just hide this thing when the conversation's, after a choice is made, basically, the conversation's over. Here's the method for removing the choices. So when we need to change the question up here, we need to go and just remove all the existing choices. And this just uses that list of the choice controllers and goes through and destroys those and then clears out that list. Don't have to do anything on start in this one. But when we initialize, which is what we're doing after the question changes, we need to set the text, the visible text to the text of the question, and then go through each of the questions choices one at a time and call that method we had looked at earlier, the static method on the choice controller, and use that to generate the choice button for each of the choices. And then we get that controller back. That's what returns from this method. So we get that controller back and we just add it to the list of controllers. So that way we always have a list of the controllers for all the choices that exist, and we can use that to interact with them. And then this just sets the template button, the game object, to inactive, so it doesn't show up. It doesn't like lay on top of the first choice. So yeah, I mean, basically you have a controller that handles the question itself, and then each of the choices have their own controller. And then it had a couple updates to the conversation controller. So just rearranged some things in here a little bit, but now I'm tracking things like if there is a conversation started, so that you can't like start more than one conversation at a time. And then we have a method here for changing the conversation, which is something that's new. So now when a choice is made, and I'll just hop back over and show you that in the UI. One of the things that we're listening to that event for, or one thing that's listening for that event is the conversation controller dot change, and it will get the new conversation. So when it gets that, it's going to say we don't have a conversation. The old conversation is no longer started. We're going to set that to false. We're going to save that new conversation, and then we can just call advanced line because we want to show the first line of that. I'll come back to these. I'll just kind of follow this thread. So advanced line is now looking to say, hey, is there any conversation? And if there isn't, it just returns. It doesn't do anything else. If there's a conversation, if there isn't a conversation started, it'll call initialize. And all initialize does is say, hey, there's a conversation started. Let's start at the beginning of that by setting the index to 0, and let's set up the left speaker and the right speaker. And then assuming all that's taken care of, it'll just basically say, hey, have we not reached the end of the conversation? If we haven't, it'll go ahead and display that line of the conversation. And nothing here is really changed. It's just looking to see if that line's for the character on the left or the character on the right, and displaying it, and then advancing the conversation one line. And if we have reached the end of the conversation, make a call to advance conversation. And what that's going to do is look to see if so we've hit the last line of these two characters talking, and it'll look to see if there's a next conversation that we should take a look at. And if there isn't, if there is, if it's not, if the conversation has a question, it's going to try to show that question. Actually, it's going to create an event saying that we want to show a question or ask a question. If there's no question defined, it's going to make sure that there's a next conversation defined. And if there is, it's going to say, hey, change the conversation to that next conversation. And then if there isn't a question and there isn't a next conversation, it's just going to end the conversation. And where's end conversation? Yeah, so that just sets conversation to nothing, to null. It says there's no conversation started, and it hides both the speaker on the left and the speaker on the right. And then this is just a little helper down here that'll set the set the speaker's dialogue, like display it and show whoever the active speaker is and hide whoever the inactive speaker is. And you can see I have a little comment here. One thing that could be improved here that I would like to improve is what's really going on here. And anytime you get an if statement like this, that's like essentially checking for different types and like a null case, is there's probably really 3 different similar objects here that should just be polymorphic. So ideally what I would be doing here, instead of doing this big check, is I would just be saying something like dialog node dot execute or invoke or whatever, and have a different type for each type of dialog node. So it would have like a question dialog node, a conversation dialog node, and an end dialog node. And those would just those could each encapsulate the things that they need to take care of, but all have the same interface. So that would let me, for example, pull like this code out into the end, an end dialog node, and a display line, for example, could probably be pulled out into its own. Oops, that's not the right one. Raising this event for like a question, that could probably be pulled out and into its own dialog node class. So anyway, that's it's an improvement I'd like to make. I just it'd be way too much to cover in one video, or way too much to tackle at one time. But this is kind of getting us into a good place where should be able to set something up like that. And if I can get it into that situation, then could probably set up a node-based editor in Unity and just kind of like connect the relevant nodes and edit things that way. So yeah, those will probably be some of the next steps in future videos, but just wanted to kind of cover this again, cover the update on this, show you the progress I've made here. And I'll just run through it here real quick one more time, just so you can see. Oh, oops, this is supposed to be off. So yeah, just quickly, you can see we've got our first conversation going. This conversation is the Chun-Li versus Evil Ryu conversation, and when we look at that over here, you can see there's no next conversation, but there is a question. The question is, who do you want to fight? And so we should get that at the end of this conversation. And you can see that is exactly what we're getting. We're getting Evil Ryu, Akuma, and Guile. And if we click on Evil Ryu this time instead of Akuma, we get a slightly different conversation here. So yeah, I mean, it's a pretty relatively simple system. As I mentioned, there's definitely some room for improvement here. And hopefully I'll be doing some more videos on that. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comment section. And if you have any suggestions on other things that you'd like to see added to this, or ideas of even other maybe unrelated videos on programming or game programming related topics, please let me know. I'm hoping to just keep making more of these, so I'm just kind of running with something that's interesting to me. But it's always good for me to know what you'd like to hear about. So yeah, thanks for watching. And like I said, I'll probably have some more videos on this topic. So I'll see you in the next one.